Welcome everybody. This is the third PHINS webinar in the 2020 series. My name is David Waite. I'm a college fellow in urban studies at the University of Glasgow. I'm sure a number of you will have been to the prior series seminars before, but just as a bit of a background, the PHINS is the Public Health Information Network for Scotland. And the seminars have been going for 20 years, but this is the first virtual seminar series. They have been organised by the good folk at the Glasgow Centre for Population Health and Public Health Scotland as part of the ScotFo collaboration. So there are 3 separate but linked online webinars focused on the impact of the context to and the emergence from the COVID-19 pandemic. And this webinar focuses on the latter, that is, emerging from the pandemic. There has been much talk in policy circles and in the media about the shock of COVID-19 and the opportunity it may present for a policy reset. How, for example, do we not only build back, but build back in a way that doesn't sow the seeds for further crises in the future? Hopefully this conversation gives scope for such a broad agenda to find expression in the Scottish context and indeed in the different regions and places across Scotland. For many, I realise social media will be your friend, so if tweeting about the webinar, please use hashtag PHINS2020. The webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event, along with copies of the presentation slides on the ScotFo website. When available, the links will be emailed to attendees. The format of the webinar today will consist of 2 20-minute presentations, followed by 15 minutes for Q&A. So we'll do all the sort of questions and answers at the end. If you wish to ask any questions, please use the quick Q&A tab, not the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And a selection of questions will then be put to the speakers in the final 15 minutes. Okay, so to introduce the speakers, our 2 speakers today are Emma Congreve from the University of Strathclyde and Dave Ray from the University of Edinburgh. So starting first, Emma Congreve is a Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the Fraser-Vallender Institute, leading the Institute's work on poverty, inequality and inclusive growth. She has previously held roles as a senior economist at the JRF, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and as an economic advisor with the Scottish Government. So with that, over to you, Emma.
Good morning. Okay, so here we go. I will share my screen. Great. So I'm planning to talk today a little bit about the coming out of the crisis, whenever that may be. So as we move now into the second 6 months of COVID-19 restrictions in Scotland, what have we learned about the ability of our society to mitigate the impact of the fallout of the pandemic? And what can this tell us about the future? So at the Fraser-Vallender Institute, we're an economic research institute, but have been doing lots of work during the pandemic to understand what's going on and the impact of some of the developments on the economy, but also importantly on individuals and households. So that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. And this is unlikely to be the last pandemic we see in our lifetime in the UK, or there will certainly be other crises that will no doubt afflict our economy. So just as improving capital reserves in the banking system was a really key focus post-financial crisis, what do we need to understand about the weaknesses that this crisis has exposed to ensure that next time we don't repeat the same harm that has been created by this crisis, and hopefully have improved living standards between crises as well. So I'm going to think about what the lessons are that the government should be heeding this time round, and I'll be talking about both the UK government and the Scottish government, but there's quite a lot of overlap between responsibilities on many of the things I'm talking about. So what are the lessons that we've learned, or as my title says, what are the problems that COVID-19 has laid bare? So I think part of the answer lies in the decade or so that came before. So I've got 2 charts here, one on the poverty rate, UK and Scotland, and the other looking at components of income for people in poverty. So if we look at the past decade, where we have gone through a period of adjustment in terms of austerity, poverty rates have risen slightly, but perhaps not on the scale that many people thought they would, due to the impact of welfare reform. And this is partly because employment has been so high, and in fact earnings were increasing at the bottom end of the income distribution. So is that a success? Well, employment has reached record highs, and we've heard a lot about that in the past few years, but there have been increasing concerns over the quality of the jobs created and the impact on the well-being of households who are relying on unpredictable hours and pay. Zero-hour contracts and precarious work is not necessarily guaranteed. So in a lot of cases, this has meant that there's not much room for manoeuvre for many households. For example, little opportunity to sort of gather savings. Analysis that we did right at the beginning of the crisis, looking at a wealth and asset survey data, showed that only 42% of Scottish households in the bottom income decile would have enough income to cover 1 month of their regular income from savings. And at the same time, the generosity of the social security system has been being eroded. So that puts us in a bit of a scary place for an economic crisis. But the resilience of households and their financial situation is very dependent on poor quality jobs in a lot of cases in the labour market. And we certainly have had an economic crisis. So this is Scottish GDP data that we have so far, and the scale of the fall in quarterly growth in GDP has been like nothing we've ever seen before. This chart doesn't go back to the financial crisis, but it's significantly more severe than in that situation. We will start to see growth in the next wee while, because things were so bad that any improvement on the lows that we saw in that Q2 will show up as growth in terms of Scottish GDP, but the levels will be far below where they would have been obviously without this crisis. And this is feeding through already to unemployment. So this is experimental claimant count for Scotland. And this is, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, is probably only part of the story in terms of unemployment. So thinking about the social security system, and what I talked about here is the social security contract that seemed to appear at the start of the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we had out of work unemployment support at its lowest ever level as a proportion of earnings. And it has obviously been eroded over the last 10 years quite significantly. But then we saw the UK government step up its support available quite significantly. So the two main changes, so there's three here, but two of them are in the same category. So the first I'll talk about is the increase in the standard allowance available under universal credit by £20 a week. And then the second were these two new schemes brought in by the Chancellor, one called the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme for employees, and the other a self-employed income support scheme. So did this represent a new consensus, a new coronavirus social contract? Because it was widely agreed that this was the right thing to do, that households should be shielded as much as possible from the economic fallout from factors completely out with their control. And it did stand in contrast to what has come before in the past 10 years. So why did that happen? One explanation was the nature of the crises, and that it was very much hoped it would be short-lived. And some businesses have started to reopen, and therefore keeping employees attached to their jobs was a really good idea to do, so you don't have to go through re-recruitment and all the costs and the loss of skills that you would find if you had to start over when your business started to reopen. The second explanation is that, sort of more related to the social contract, that given the scale of the shutdown, the falls in income for people who were going from their normal salary down to universal credit levels, even with that £20 increase, would have been so much of a shock to the system for so many people that it would have just created a lot of damage and just wouldn't have been acceptable by the population. So not only would it also impacted on the sort of financial well-being of those affected, but it would also have had secondary impacts in terms of aggregate demand in the wider economy. So there were reasons within that why these schemes came in and were so generous in a lot of cases. But not all were afforded the protection. People did sort of fall through the gaps. And not all people on benefits got the £20 increase. It was only those on universal credit and tax credits. It didn't extend to some of those older legacy benefits, such as job seekers allowance. So it was a partial social contract, if that's what it was. And indeed, as we're seeing now, a lot of these schemes are being sort of rolled back, as you would probably expect with a recovery underway, but we are still mid-pandemic. We're not out of the woods. So many people do think some of this is premature. But we've got the job retention scheme ending and the job support scheme coming in, which is less generous, and most people do think it will lead to significant increases in unemployment for jobs that for workplaces where people just cannot come back in and do a decent amount of hours. And we don't yet know what will happen to the £20 increase in universal credit. There was a letter that went out from a number of charities to the UK government yesterday asking for it to be continued, but as yet we're not sure if it will continue post April 2021. So, I mean, what does this all tell us for the future? Was it just a temporary reprieve for people who lose their job due to factors out with their control, or will we have a new kind of consensus that will come through what we will still see in the next 6 months, which is a lot of change and a lot of people losing their job? It's really hard to know, but what do we need to think about in terms of the importance of financial resilience and stability for people going into crises, in the good times and going into the next crises? I think it's a really important thing to be thinking about. So before I just talk a little bit more about some of the future impacts, I'm just going to touch on another area of work that we are looking at the Fraser. So we've started a programme of work looking at adults with learning disabilities. And again, this is an area that's seen quite a lot of financial pressure over the past 10 years, that's maybe not left it in the place that we would hope it to be. And what is clear that as a lot of services have just disappeared for people during the pandemic, as resources have been moved in order to sort of tackle on the more of the front line of the pandemic related issues. And these services had already been reduced quite significantly. And these services are maybe not the kind of the statutory services, but they are the services that help people sort of navigate their everyday life. And for people with learning disabilities, during a pandemic where there is so much public health messaging to understand, so much kind of change going on in terms of services being open or shut, or there's just so much to take on board and to handle. They found that the support that helped them to do that, to navigate everyday life, has been the services that they've lost. So you can see from this chart that a huge proportion of people have just had their support stopped completely. And one of the people we spoke to just described these services as that it's the support that helps, that enables them to keep a roof over their head for himself and his son. He has learning disabilities and he needs that support with his financial situation in order to keep on top of things. So what harm are we creating here? And what is the burden that's being put on unpaid carers where they do exist? Not every person with a learning disability has a family member that can step in and care for them, but where there are unpaid carers, they really have been picking up a lot of the work that was otherwise done by these services. So these data and this quote is from a survey done by the Scottish Commission on Learning Disabilities. And there is that question of what harm are we creating here and how long will it take? What needs to be done to get people back on an even footing? And I mean, a question for me as an analyst is what kind of analysis went into these decisions in terms of what services to scale back and what to continue with. It all happened so fast that I'm not sure all that much was done at all. So just to finish off with some conclusions. So there's there was a very clear kind of move towards a hopeful debate on building back better that we saw probably quite near the start of the crises, and some of that has maybe has met reality a bit, and as we've seen what's been happening, particularly with the UK government, it doesn't feel that, you know, big mass change is necessarily on the cards in terms of some of the social security support, or in terms of a continuation of expansion of the state. I might be wrong on this, but that feels like where we are at the moment. So where do we need to focus on this building back better debate? I mean, getting the basics right would obviously be a start. I mean, we've seen a huge increase in food bank numbers, and just getting those basics in terms of food and shelter, that shouldn't be beyond us. And, you know, arguably these are the most important things to get right. So that doesn't necessarily mean new and exciting policies. It doesn't necessarily mean a complete replacement of systems. We do have a lot of the right infrastructure in place. I might be unpopular saying this, but universal credit as a system, well, as an infrastructure, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way it's been, it's run. It's the way the priorities are set in terms of the conditionality and the adequacy of the payments that exist through it. But it doesn't necessarily mean we have to throw it all away and start again. We just have to assess priorities and try and make that marginal change where it will actually make that biggest difference in people's lives. I think that kind of returning to understanding long-term implications, and particularly the prevention agenda, which has been such a key part of Scottish debate for many years, but where, we've just had a health crisis, and we know that health inequalities have exacerbated a lot of the impacts. We do need to be reminding ourselves and policymakers of the importance of prevention as we go on. And it is, of course, Scotland does have difficulties in terms of being able to, do exactly what it wants to do. We have our own tax raising powers, but we are also constrained a lot by what the UK government decides to do in terms of whether they're going to borrow extra in order to increase support in devolved areas, which would then transfer through the Barnett formula. So there are constraints there in terms of budgets, but we still have a budget of, revenue budget of 35 million in Scotland, 35 billion, sorry. So we can make choices. The government does have to prioritise, and they do have to justify those priorities. And hopefully the election next year will give that opportunity for some of that debate to happen. So that is all I wanted to say, and I'm going to pass back now to David.
Super stuff. Thanks very much, Emma. I might just ask you to stop sharing the slides if that's possible. Thank you. Okay, that's great. Before I pass over to Dave, our second speaker, just a reminder to use the Q&A for all your urgent and pressing questions, and we'll collate all those at the end and put them to the speakers. And also a reminder that you don't have to be sort of scribbling everything down vigorously right now. The slides will become available at the end. So with that, I'll pass on to our second speaker, Dave, and over to you, Dave, if you can start sharing your slides.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'll give it a go, see if it works. Always that worrying moment, isn't it, on Zoom? Great, hopefully that's going live. So thanks for having me along for this. So I'm going to talk about, as it says, realising a green recovery. So as a climate change scientist, it's been, it's really interesting now giving talks, because normally they are a little bit bleak. Doing something which combines climate change with COVID is, yeah, a perfect recipe for bleakness. But hopefully in my 20 minutes, I can point to some, I guess, silver linings in the year to 18 months to come. So I guess starting off with a fairly bleak outlook, we've got this perfect storm of a global pandemic, but a climate and nature crisis still going on. So climate change, as thankfully our politicians seem to be aware of, hasn't gone away. What we've got as a major risk, and Emma referred to some of the context to this, is that COVID-19 is exacerbating some of the inequalities in our society, and potentially really undermining our progress to tackling climate change. So the Paris goals of keeping global temperatures to less than 2 degrees of warming, they're still there, but obviously attention has been very much diverted away from those. And there's a real risk, as we know, that we put effort into recovery, which is kind of completely justified in terms of immediate actions, but actually locks in a future where we can't meet the Paris goals and we actually face much more severe climate change impacts. So one direct consequence we've had of COVID in terms of, I guess, the climate policy world is COP26, so the Conference of the Parties 26, this big climate change meeting that should have been in Glasgow next month, and it's been postponed until the first 2 weeks of November next year. And that meeting was crucial because it was essentially the test point for all nations to come together and say, are we doing enough? Are we on track to meet the Paris goals? How can we up our ambitions? And the truth is that we're nowhere near on track to meet the Paris goals, and that was before COVID. And so we've got this big green recovery question. Actually, as we recover, can we recover in a way which doesn't make the mistakes that we had after the financial crisis in terms of just going back to business as usual and locking into high carbon futures, but actually can we make that recovery a green one and align it with tackling climate change and the nature crisis? And so there are signs that some governments and certainly quite a few organisations are trying to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where I see as the major kind of challenges, but also opportunities. So this picture is, I guess, one of the conversations that we're having with our students at the moment, who obviously are back at uni, albeit under strange circumstances, is about, all right, the climate crisis hasn't gone away, but surely we've got some major benefit in terms of emissions by global lockdown. So the lack of travel, people staying at home, less energy use, scenes like this around the world. And when we look at the data, so I'll just show you analysis from my colleague Piers Forster, it's kind of amazing in terms of the kind of drop in emissions we've seen around the world. So this is, you can see the lockdown in China initially and their emissions going down, and then the rest of the world following. So we've seen this huge drop in carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel burning, mainly from transport, but also less energy being used for our offices and schools, etc. So that kind of makes you think, well, we've had this awful, obviously, pandemic impact, but actually it's cut emissions. So that's a bright side. The key with this, though, is you can see on the right hand side, and these data only go up to towards the end of the summer, that as we come out of our lockdowns, the emissions go back up. So it's that kind of, it's not like, we are staying at that lower emission level. But more importantly for carbon dioxide is a 1 year blip really doesn't have a very big impact. So it's a big drop, but it's in an ocean of CO2. So this is from the mid-19th century, how much CO2 is emitted into our atmosphere globally. And you can see how it's increased as we've industrialized around the world. And as you can see on the top right there, the estimate is that massive drop that we've seen in 2020, in terms of the cumulative carbon dioxide, because it lasts for many centuries in the atmosphere, it'll be about 0.1% drop. So this kind of, even though it's a bit of a techie figure, basically what it's saying is we need to look at the coming years and actually achieve the kind of carbon dioxide reductions we've seen under COVID lockdown globally. We need to replicate those each year from now on, but obviously not with the kind of restrictions that we've had under COVID. So it's kind of made quite stark how far off track we are in terms of, like I say, meeting the Paris goals, and that we can't just rely on this year having been like a good one for carbon dioxide, even though it's been bad for pretty much everything else. So some crucial sectors to make that recovery one which does align with the Paris goals, does mean that we keep on reducing global emissions. So these are sectors, and I put some in brackets because the green recovery applies across all sectors, but some of them are particularly important because they're kind of high carbon sectors, so big emitters. They're also high risk, either from COVID itself or from the transition that we've got to have to get to net zero. So the energy sector is one that's been in the news a lot based on the oil price, and that putting a lot of jobs at risk. But that was already a sector that was transitioning really fast, that really needed a lot of rapid change from its current operation towards being part of, obviously, renewable generation. So one of the things we're seeing in Scotland, for instance, and particularly in Aberdeen and the North Sea, is employers there and the energy companies looking at their trajectory and their workforce, looking at technologies like carbon capture and storage. This is where we capture carbon and put it back underground, looking at the hydrogen economy, and looking at where actually employment and reskilling in those areas can buffer some of the impacts, of COVID and the big downturn in terms of oil price, to actually secure those livelihoods and align with net zero. The other one, which is really obvious for all of us, is transport. So, the impacts we've had in terms of public transport have been really acute, but also just in terms of how we get around. So, the home working, all of us now on our computers, rather than traveling to get together. And that has its downsides, but also it has big implications for emissions from transport, for employment as well. There are real opportunities in that sector too, as we electrify transport, actually to make it lower carbon, but also through green recovery, to look at where we're getting it wrong on transport at the moment in terms of those inequalities between rural and urban areas. Can we use rural hub investment in terms of online facilities, better broadband connections, which is a real issue for a lot of Scotland still, and actually use the green recovery not just to address climate change and to get us through COVID, but actually, again, as Emma said, address some of these fundamental inequalities and weaknesses in our system in Scotland and the UK. Another sector, so I'll mention these relatively quickly. So buildings is a major one, particularly because it's a source of a lot of emissions, particularly heating our buildings in Scotland and the UK. Our buildings on average are not very energy efficient. And we're seeing a big opportunity there in terms of investment in training and jobs around energy efficiency and building retrofit. So there's a real opportunity for that sector, actually, again, to give us a buffer against the employment losses from COVID, but also align with net zero. And the final one on here I'll mention is land use, because it's dear to my heart. And it's one of those sectors which is really facing the perfect storm. It's a sector where it needs to deliver a huge amount for net zero. So we need agriculture emissions to fall substantially, but also our land use generally to sequester a lot of carbon. So we need more tree planting, peatland restoration, more soil carbon sequestration. But it needs to do all of that in the context of leaving the Common Agricultural Policy and leaving the EU. So the challenges for that sector, for employment and for alignment with net zero, are huge. For all of these, and this is completely my bias, so I admit it, but it's somewhat, based on the evidence, and I'll put up a link after the talk that backs this up, is education is actually core to the green recovery more widely, but in terms of addressing the alignment of these sectors with net zero and with securing livelihoods, protecting jobs. So just as some examples that I've called climate emergency skills. So the kind of skills that we knew we needed to expand on before COVID, but have become really acutely needed, given the context that, like I say, we need to buffer livelihoods from unemployment due to COVID, give opportunities, particularly for young people who are being disproportionately affected in terms of opportunities. So expansion of training and apprenticeship. We've seen the scheme from the Prime Minister just recently announced down south, and in our programme for government in Scotland, again, a lot of emphasis on giving more opportunities. One of the key things the UK government hasn't really overtly done yet, but the Scottish government has done, is actually align this with green skills. So we know that it's a great return on investment to invest in education, and that we've got these big skills gaps looming. But actually, the green skills narrative of aligning with where we've got to go on net zero, and transitioning these sectors to something which is more sustainable. Actually, that's a really powerful focus, I think, and it's been great to see that narrative coming through quite strongly, like I say, in the programme for government. Mixed in with all of this are things like online access. So again, in terms of that accessibility, that equity, being able to make sure people can actually access education which is relevant to them, it's free at the point of use, and that, yeah, if you're trying to juggle care and work, sometimes online access can give you that little bit of extra flexibility that you need. There's a real role for this, obviously, in terms of looking at the climate relevant skills across school level, and CPD, so continuing professional development for people who are in work. And I think one of the big jobs we've got in higher education and further education is to look at our role in this. So obviously we're being affected by COVID like all sectors. It's given us an opportunity to think about online learning and our provision, but it's also an opportunity for us to ask the question, are we aligned with a green recovery and for what Scotland and the UK need, not just right now, but in the years and decades to come. So one of the things that we've been talking about as part of a network of educational institutions is actually a green skills action plan. Is actually looking at what we provide at the moment. Have we got what is needed, like I say, to actually meet the needs of new students, of people who are upskilling, people who are maybe making that transition, if you're an oil worker, to carbon capture and storage. Have we got that capacity? Really importantly, have we got it in the right place? Have we got it so they can access it locally? Because these things, there's regional diversities, we know, in Scotland and the UK, in terms of where the jobs are required, and where people live. And also this question about time. Are we putting on the right provision at the right time? So are we training people for jobs that don't exist? That's not very useful. So how can we link up with employers, with the government, to actually get that place and time part right? And I mentioned equality and accessibility need to be at the heart of this. So the Just Transition Commission here in Scotland, they've done some brilliant work. They published their interim report recently, which I would recommend, looking at how COVID is, like I say, exacerbating some of these inequalities and how they might be addressed. And I guess with all of this, it's thinking about that place base, so thinking about the local narrative, but getting it right in terms of the national policy, and actually going back to our role as Scotland and the UK as hosts for this big climate conference next year, actually looking at what good global practice there is, but also looking at how we can share that good practice. And there's going to be, I hope, a lot of opportunity for that, certainly in the coming year. So just to finish, in terms of realising a green recovery, and hopefully be a bit more positive. So there are some big uncertainties in terms of where we go on this. There's international politics on climate change. What happens in the US election will be really, really important in terms of how much all the nations commit. So it won't just be what the US does, but that has sent a signal right around the world. But we've seen China actually come forward already with much more significant commitments on climate change. So that international politics side can be a real barrier, but it also can facilitate us as the UK and Scotland doing more. COVID-19 continues, as we all know, to be a big uncertainty in terms of what that will mean for how we live, how we react to things like climate change, where our priorities are, and the recession as part of that, in terms of just our capacity to stop people falling out of employment and actually falling out of the loop in terms of delivering on net zero. So looking at those skills and those training packages in terms of avoiding long-term unemployment, giving opportunities for the young in particular, but also those who are finding themselves underemployed or unemployed in a lot of vulnerable sectors. We've got looming Brexit too, And that's going to, like I say, affect a lot of things, particularly around the agriculture sectors, has big concerns around there. But all of these things are, in my view, things which can be, at least in part, addressed through education. So I guess my main thread, hopefully, that's come through about 20 times already, in terms of realising a green recovery, at the heart of that is education. And it's not just skills and education for recovery, but it's for a green recovery. So it's really alignment with delivery of net zero, as well as getting us through this COVID crisis. Thank you.
Okay. Many thanks, Dave. That's tremendous. Okay, so we have a good chunk of time now for some questions. So we've got some coming through already, and for the other participants, now's your time to shine. Get those questions coming in. So to kick this off, we'll start with a couple questions for Emma, if that's okay, Emma. So one from Fiona Crawford here, asking about what scope SG has to sort of change wages, quality of work for carers as the first part, and also sort of picking up on your disabilities points about where sort of there might be scope and sort of funding and training regimes for things to change. Just wondering if you can talk to those points.
Yeah, so the way obviously that funding flows through to local government is determined by a few factors, but particularly the block grant from the Scottish Government is usually one of the most important parts, and there's adjustments done for council tax and non-domestic rates within that. So so that is obviously a really important component, and the Scottish Government usually at the moment it's on a year-by-year basis is determining how much of that block grant goes through. And there is that question about whether, to what extent is the block grant that goes to local government, which is done as part of the budget process, to what extent is that sort of a well thought through and understood part of the process, or is it just the residual once everything else has been worked out? Of course, there are always competing priorities within government, but I think over the last 10 years, there have been a lot of cuts passed through to local government, potentially more than has gone through to other parts of the, well, not potentially, more cuts than have gone through to other parts of Scottish funding, albeit less severe than has happened down south. So it's all relative in some respects, but I think it's looking at where the priorities are, and that and being, there's a lot of kind of almost PR washing over the local government settlements sometimes, in terms of has it gone up, has it gone down, and actually is it sufficient for the priorities that need to be delivered. And the paying of social care wages is such an important priority for so many people, and for the quality of services that are delivered. So I think funding is quite is crucial in terms of there being the ability to pass on money to those working on the front line. So I mean, I'm not an expert on learning disabilities. There are many organisations that have a much better place to speak about the kind of where the sort of funding should go and the training that's needed, but just ensuring that the funding is well thought through and sufficient for the priorities that the government itself is setting in terms of its wellbeing and inclusive economy agenda, I think is probably where I would start my thoughts on this.
Okay, super, thanks, Emma. A question I think can be posed to both speakers is from Stephanie Houston, saying COVID-19 has highlighted health inequalities in our society. Do you think that universal basic income, which has been much discussed here in Scotland, would be a better system to reduce poverty and other health inequalities in our community? Maybe open to both speakers, I think.
Yeah, so I'll start on this. So we actually did a programme of work which finished about 6 months ago, and partly funded by Public Health Scotland, looking at universal basic income. And as with any system like this, there's trade-offs. It's not a silver bullet. And whether there is evidence that it would reduce health inequalities in the long run is a bit of an unknown. Just the evidence base is limited at the moment. But what we do know is that yeah, there's trade-offs between adequacy and universalism. So if you have a universal system, for the same pot of money that you have, you can give less money to people. If you have a means-tested system, you can give more money to people at the lower end of the income distribution. But with that, there are trade-offs in terms of incentives and tapers and stigma. So there's trade-offs both ways. But I feel from the analysis that I saw my colleagues at the Fraser did, given the cost of the system, of a universal system, there would be a danger that it would increase, well, it would reduce support for some people that really need it at the bottom of the income distribution. So it could definitely in the short run have a negative impact on poverty. But those long run kind of, changes in behavior in terms of security of having universal basic income, of course there's a possibility that could over, a very long run have more positive implications, but it's a big gamble to take when we know that in the short run we'd have to reduce some of the amounts of money going to people on the lowest income. So I guess I'm a little bit skeptical about whether it would, well, I don't think it would reduce poverty unless we found some big magic money trees somewhere. But the longer run impacts on health inequalities are yet to be understood, I think is what I would say.
Okay, that's great. Dave, unless you want to come in on that, there's one here directly for you. How much emphasis on educating attitudes do you think is required to make a significant difference to sort of the green recovery you've been speaking about?
Yeah, so it's hugely important, and we knew this again before COVID, that actually addressing climate change up until recently, a lot of that has been around stuff we don't see as individuals. So when we turn on the lights, when we turn on our computers at the moment, they're lower carbon electricity that we get, and that hasn't affected our behaviors, and it hasn't directly affected our attitudes. I think now we're in a situation where the harder stuff is coming down the line in terms of how we're all affected in terms of our lifestyles, the choices we have to make. So there's a great question from Fiona about car use and educating people out of their cars. And that is something which is, we've seen with our response to COVID, actually how rapidly and at what kind of scale we can have these behaviour changes. So it's given some insights into that, but it's also shown us kind of how our social norms, how important they are in terms of our behaviours, and also how much rebound there is. So as soon as you take off the kind of the directive, then that tendency to go back to business as usual. So the awareness is really important. In Scotland, we have a higher awareness of climate change, for instance, than most nations, and we've seen that rise rapidly. I think not just because of things like the school climate strikes have been instrumental, and our government policy is ambitious in terms of cutting emissions. But actually, one of the things we have in Scotland, I think, is I guess a history of a good understanding of our environment. I think we're close to it. We've got some great green space. One of the great things to come through actually from lockdown was even greater appreciation for that, particularly in our cities, in terms of that green space and that valuing of it. And I'm hoping, so this kind of is trying to answer Fiona's question as well. One of the things is that with that valuing of, I guess you call it nature or green space, comes with it even more engagement with the kind of green recovery narrative, and saying, okay, we can't use public transport as much as we could before. So you kind of get in the car because you think, right, that will be safer. But actually, as a city, we've seen the roads closed temporarily to allow more cyclists and walkers and make it safer. Actually, we're in a situation at the moment where that could be made permanent. And actually, we don't just go back to, it's building back, it is building back better, that hackneyed phrase. And part of that is really making the most of those few silver linings we've had in human behaviour. The other point I wanted to make, just related to what Emma was saying, so it's obviously certainly not my area of speciality at all, in terms of that universal kind of payment, but the closest example to that is what we're seeing with agricultural support. So support for farmers, and that spreads through into rural communities. And at the moment that is diversified. It's based on the Common Agricultural Policy, but we are facing, as a nation across the UK and Scotland too, a decision about how that's going to change. And you could imagine, so some of the frameworks which have been suggested for that are more about a kind of universal level of support, and something which is focused more on things like addressing climate change, which sounds great. That's really dangerous if we went down that route, certainly, without a substantial amount of tapering or transition. Because if we think about Scotland and our rural communities, at the moment we're differentially supported in what are called less favoured areas, the islands as well, because of the land we've got and the climate and what we have to work with as farmers. So again, that differentiation, has its value, and one of the biggest risks with anything which is universal is that it gives you a baseline, but that baseline fails significant numbers of people. And so I would be quite cautious of it, but it's not my area of expertise. But in agriculture, that would be potentially disastrous for our sector.
Okay, that's super. That's super. A few questions have come in about sort of the challenges for public spending in the years ahead. Obviously, we haven't had austerity yet, although there's murmurings that might come back. Reflecting both your slides, where do you see, to both speakers, where do you see the risks relating to sort of straightening public finances, whether that's through tax rises, through public expenditure cuts? Can you both reflect on that relative to your sort of visions of the Building Back Better, perhaps?
Yeah, shall I start? So yes, it's unclear, I would say, the extent to which or how soon we need to start thinking about reducing public spending. I think there is an acknowledgement that we're in very exceptional times, and the markets don't seem to be being particularly spooked by what's going on. So the UK can still borrow very cheaply, and has been able to do quite significantly, but it probably can't continue forever. There are some people that do believe so, but yeah, I think most people reflecting on what happened maybe in some parts of Europe in the last financial crisis will kind of feel more, okay, we probably do need to straighten things out at some point. So far there does appear to be, there doesn't seem to be this kind of, well, we'll do it via the social security system, which is good, because it's already been cut to the bone. And there's probably not a lot more that you can take out of that system. With the £20 a week, we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. So it does look like it's tax rises where more money will be raised, and that leads us into great, fascinating debates as economists in terms of where those tax rises should be, to be most equitable, to be most acceptable to society, and those two things could be very different, particularly people who lose out will tend to shout very loudly about it. So yeah, I think that's the next kind of once hopefully we have a vaccine and we start to move out of this crisis, there will be those conversations, I think, about tax, and we can have those conversations in Scotland as well. It's not just what the UK government does. We have our own powers of income tax, but there may be a re-emergence of debate on things like council tax, which I've worked on quite a lot over the years, and wealth tax and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's not going to be easy, and tax is not popular, but I do feel hopeful that we're not going to see the same kind of pushback on people on low incomes, that it will be more and actually, will it be the people who haven't been affected by this crisis financially? will there be some kind of push? Well, you know, some people have done fine. You know, work from home, don't have to pay for commuting anymore. You know, is there a responsibility for parts of society that haven't really been financially impacted to take some of the weight of that? Yeah, but I think that might be quite unpopular.
It's a tough question. Yeah, Dave, do you have any thoughts relative to the green recovery?
Yeah, just that it's a very timely one, given we've got an election coming up. So it'll be interesting to see what the manifesto, how they approach this. You know, whether it's more taxation or not. I think for the reality is, for the current government and whatever the future government is here and down south, it's also reprioritisation. So, you know, it's looking at some of the big capital spend like road building and saying, actually, maybe that was justified before COVID, but things have changed. Do we now carry on building roads, you know, based on that business as usual and going back to that? Or actually, is there a new way of using this budget more effectively, like broadband provision, like I said, or more public transport access in rural areas? So I think, you know, I would hate to be in government at the moment, because, you know, that reprioritization, that's really difficult. And it's always, you know, you've got this small pot which is diminishing in some circumstances, and you've got lots of things you've got to try and meet. But I think my plea actually, and I think this is true across a lot of the climate change community, is for those decisions to be looked at through the lens of a green recovery, because often that reprioritization, you know, if you look at it through that lens, that gives you a good guide to where you'll get the best return on investment. So the link I'm going to post in a minute, we did some work looking at, if you invest as a government in different things, what the return is in terms of jobs and what the return is in terms of cutting emissions. And the things which come out as a win each time are things like investment in infrastructure for the energy system and renewables, and education. So actually using that kind of that lens, I think, is really helpful.
Super. I think a couple of questions coming through, and to synthesize slightly, are asking how we sort of pair up or get together, you know, these big meta themes that are circulating at the moment. So we have, on the one hand, you know, inclusive growth, dealing with stark inequalities that exist, and on the other hand, trying to build a green recovery. Do you have any views or any evidence or any suggested frameworks by which policymakers can think about how these two big objectives tie up? Are there trade-offs when we make an investment in a green recovery? Might we be risking the costs of inequality in some senses? How do we get a sense of pushing towards both these objectives, and can we develop frameworks that would allow us to look at that? What do things like the Green Book give any guidance at the project level on this? Do you have any views? I know it's a terrifically awkward question, but just wondered if you have any views on how we achieve both these two big things. If we go back to the Scottish Infrastructure Commission, you know, they were going for net carbon zero inclusive growth, or something like that. How would you actually achieve that? Any thoughts?
So yeah, the Green Book is a way of appraising. There's a set of guidelines for appraising public sector expenditure, particularly on capital projects, but it can be used for revenue as well. And within that, there's kind of a set of options that you can put in. So many people just think the Green Book prioritizes GDP growth over everything else. I mean, that's how some people use appraisal methodology, but the Green Book doesn't say that's how you have to do it. So there are other priorities that you can put into appraisals in order to look at the trade-offs between different options. So so GDP growth, if that's what you want, jobs, but also you can look at weighting for inequality, so impact on different parts of the income distribution, and you can look at impacts on CO2 emissions as well. So I think any policy decision has an opportunity cost, has a trade-off, and appraisal methodologies give you the chance to look at those on a comparable basis. So I think they are really valuable. I don't think the appraisal methodology is used as routinely as it could be in Scotland, particularly around decisions that happen, so big funding decisions like budget time. And I particularly don't think that there's enough focus on inequality analysis that feeds into decisions. It may be done after the fact, but in terms of being core to the policy decision that's made. So there are tools that we have that will help us do that. But I mean, you asked us, are there trade-offs? And yes, there are always trade-offs. And a lot of it's about deciding, the government being very clear what its priorities are. So some of this in New Zealand, when they did their wellbeing budget, they kind of had some very clear priorities that they wanted all their new spending in the budget to align to in some way. And that was a trade-off in itself. But you know, there are ways of thinking about this, but it requires transparency, and it means not doing everything or not pretending you're doing everything. So
the New Zealand example is really good because they have actually quite clear sort of green book-like examples on how to achieve the wellbeing budget. So there's actually quite nice manuals on how to put this into place. Dave, I'll leave the final remarks to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are trade-offs all the way. The key thing I think that we've been missing is not even knowing what those trade-offs are. You know, in terms of the procurement's a really good example of that, where you're really not making the decision, or you're making the decision in a framework which is restrictive, but also you haven't got the full information. You're not saying, okay, what does it look like in terms of the GDP benefit or the carbon benefit? You know, not even having that information to then take your value judgment and go, this is what we're going to go for. So that's urgently needed. It is coming through. It's one of those things that ultimately the buck does stop with our elected representatives to make that value judgment based on what we've kind of voted them in for. But it's giving that information. And going back again, land use and agriculture, like I say, is the sector I focus on, and that's a perfect example of this, where that's got to change a lot in terms of how we use the land. And so looking at how that change is supported in a way where we know what trade-offs we're making. Are we planting trees for carbon? That's great, but often there's a trade-off there in terms of food production. So we need to go in with our eyes open, and that applies across all of these decisions. And in Scotland, thankfully, I think we kind of know that, it's not just us as academics, but I think the government get it. We've got a really good research basis for that kind of evidence that goes into the decision making. But yeah, ultimately they're tough decisions, and they're getting even tougher.
Super. Okay, thanks, Dave. Well, look, one minute to go. Thank you very much for everyone. Thank you to the speakers, Dave and Emma, for the stimulating thoughts. A lot to think of, go away with now and contemplate. Many thanks to all the participants and all your questions. Hopefully we managed to get through a few, if not all, the questions. So thanks for putting those forward. A few thanks to the organisers, to all the good folk at GCPH who have set this up, and to Jane Parkinson and Carl Ferguson at Public Health Scotland. So many thanks again for coming along, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.